I'm flying without my wingman today. Okay, we are live.
Awesome.
We welcome you to Real Talk, History as a Weapon for Black Liberation. And I'm your host, Dr. Sundiata Kaita Chajua. And this podcast is part of the Black Power Media Network.
Mhm.
Okay. We have as today's guest, and this is truly a pleasure, uh, Professor John Jennings. He is an author, graphic novelist, curator, Harvard Fellow, New York Times best-selling author, 2018 Eisner winner, and a Hugo and Bram Stoker Award-winning artist and writer. As professor of media and cultural studies at the University of California, Riverside, Jennings examines the visual culture of race in various media forms, including graphic novels, film, illustrated fiction, and comics. He is also the director of the Abrams Comics imprint, Megascope, which publishes graphic novels focused on the experiences of people of color. His research interests include the visual culture of hip hop, Afrofuturism and politics, visual literacy, horror, and ethnographic and speculative design and its applications to visual rhetoric. Jennings is the co-editor of the 2016 Eisner Award-winning collection, The Blacker the Ink, Constructions of Black Identity in Comics, and co-founder and organizer of the Schomburg Center's Black Comic Book Festival in Harlem. Jennings has just co-founded a new Black Comics Festival at the California African American Museum and is currently working on the creation of a new Black superhero called Ghostlight for Marvel Comics, and it's due out in February of 2023, just in time to kick off Black History Month.
Exactly, because it's February 1st too.
There you go. A lot of history there in February 1st.
For
The
real.
sit-in movement begins.
Oh man. See?
Yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that.
Saturated in blackness.
Yeah.
Brother John, as I said, man, it's good to see you.
Yeah. Way too long.
It's been a minute.
Way too
So
long, brother. Yeah, we need to do better, actually. So
yeah, we will do better. We will
we
do
will.
better in the future.
There you go.
So on Real Talk, I always begin by trying to give my audience a sense of the background of the guest by asking the guest some biographical questions that's aimed at uh, getting at the processes by which you became the person you are today.
Right.
So, what I'm interested in is to understand how your background. Now, you're born and raised in Mississippi in the Delta, and
Well,
what I want you to do is
Mississippi.
kind of discuss the historical moment
Okay.
of your formative years
Okay.
that place the Delta and your class background and how those things interacted to help construct
Hmm.
the person that you are today.
Okay.
And I'm especially interested in incidents that made you conscious of your blackness, your maleness,
Hmm.
etc. And any books, uh, individuals who influenced and helped shape you.
Yes. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
got the floor.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you for being here. And again, I want to apologize for the baby shark coming in from. I don't know if you hear it, but my toddler is like right over there. So
Okay.
so apologies for that. Oh, and other things like I'm not from the Delta. I'm from Central Mississippi.
Oh, you from Central Mississippi?
Yes, I'm closer to like Jackson. I was born in Brookhaven, Mississippi, which is about an hour and a half north of New Orleans, actually. Where, of course, you probably know that there was a horrible racialized incident around voting there. That's one of the things that Brookhaven is famous for. This gentleman was shot trying to fight for black voting rights, actually, in Brookhaven.
Yeah.
So I was born there. And then I was raised in Flora, Mississippi, which is about 15 miles north of Jackson, which of course is the capital.
Mhm.
So Madison County, I came from a very agrarian space, in poverty essentially, or at least like lower, working class, space. primarily raised by my mom, who was a single mom, and also my grandparents. My grandfather Albert was illiterate; he couldn't read or write, but worked as an itinerant worker for white landowners who, essentially we just lived in the house that was on the land that he was tending to. So essentially, he would like.
So he's a sharecropper.
It was a sharecropper adjacent. You know what I'm saying? Because he wasn't making crops, but he was actually like feeding cattle, mending fences, stuff like that.
Okay.
My grandmother had a fourth grade education, but they both were like huge supporters of education, because I think despite that access and despite my grandfather had to drop out of school to actually take care of his family, essentially, so because his father died. So it's like age-old story, almost cliche in some ways,
So what time period are we talking about?
So we're talking like I was born in 1970, so like that particular era. So I grew up in that space, and I want to say like the first time I really thought about my blackness or the idea of being black is probably Roots, right? Roots came on in
1975.
75. So yeah, because
no. So it might have been 77.
No, 77. Yeah, 77.
No.
So I remember like
76,
7 years old.
77. Yeah.
And the thing that got me, I wanted to contextualize it because my grandfather was like, outside my mom, was like, one of the most important figures in my life. He was like my first superhero to a certain degree. And even though he wasn't one to posit like different types of like, he didn't talk a lot. He was very stoic. But he worked very hard and he took care of us. You know what I'm saying? And I think some of my work ethic comes from him. So he was like I loved him. You know what I'm saying? He was like, he was just like my everything.
Yeah.
And so I remember seeing like I forgot which character it was. It reminded me so much of my grandfather on Roots. You know what I'm saying? I can't remember which one it was at the moment because it's been so long. And I also remember, so it's two jarring things about that. The first jarring thing was like they took, which I thought was brilliant, white actors that were connected to more positive, more uplifting roles. Like for instance, the actor that played in the father in the Brady Bunch, which I knew very well, right? Or Ed Asner, right, who was in Lou Grant.
Right.
These are good white people, right? Right?
Absolutely.
Right. And they put them in these roles that were horrible, right? It's the first thing, right? And then the other juxtaposition was the fact that we had like, these people owning slaves and hurting black people who look like I got the same thing. People who look like my grandfather, you see what I'm saying, and my grandmother. And so it shook me, you know what I'm saying? It shook me because I was like, wait a minute, what is this race? What is this thing, that the slavery thing? Who are these people and how does it relate to folk who look like me? And then I started realizing, oh my God, I'm black. You know what I'm saying? And my grandfather's black. And these, you know what I'm saying? My little mind was blown, and I was like, and I went to school. It was almost like, it reminded me of something that was just earth shattering was when I is the day after 9/11. Like how people were just shook.
Yeah.
I went to school and I was like talking to my friends. I was like, did you see Roots? Some of them hadn't seen it, didn't know what I was talking about. And I was like, it and I remember it like yesterday. And I was like, man, it was an extremely polarizing thing. Now, mind you, coming up in a black part of town or black primarily black school. I mean, even though this is supposedly after segregation,
right?
Migrations happened. I still went to a primarily black school. Like, in fact, I didn't see a white student come until like many years later.
Okay.
And because he was not wealthy enough to go to the Tri-County Academy, which was like the preparatory school for all the kids of the white landowners who pretty much controlled the agrarian, space that I lived in, right? So, and I think that was a very, very polarizing thing for me. I remember also the first time I saw Monica Rambeau, the black Captain Marvel, the first black woman who played, because I was a big comics fan like yourself.
Yeah.
And I really liked Captain Marvel. I liked, the Kree warrior, the blonde, blonde hair, blue eyed, white dude, but he was a great character, and he dies of cancer, right? And then they replaced him with a black woman. And I remember thinking, like, man, she reminded me so much of my mother. And that was like one of the first times that I actually was like, yeah, because my mom, even though she's not of the same complexion, she had an afro like that. She had a big afro. It was beautiful.
Yeah.
And I was like, man, she looks like my mom, and I remember feeling a sense of pride that, someone like who looked like my mom was a superhero,
Yeah.
And then now, as far as mentors, I was very fortunate enough to have a librarian that I looked up to. Her name was Miss Berry, and she would actually like be very cognizant of like giving students like Black themed authors to read, Black poetry books, you know. So I learned about like someone like Sonia Sanchez. I remember her giving me a book of Sonia Sanchez poems, stuff like that. Or like listening to the students and knowing what we wanted to look to. I was really into stargazing. Like I was really into astronomy and stuff at an early age, Greek mythology, Egyptian mythology, stuff like that. So she would give me books on this, And I had 3 library cards coming up. Actually, I read like voraciously. So I had one from Florida, Mississippi, where I was one at Jackson, and I had one at Canton, Mississippi, which is the county seat. And my mom and I, who was also an avid reader, we would go around and would pick up books in all 3 spaces. I would participate in like, those summer reading competitions and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I was like, who the heck is reading more books than I am? I could never win it. I was like, oh, I'm gonna win this. Anyway, somebody's cheating, Anyway, and then of course, but I looked up to Miss Berry. I also looked up to my, I had a math teacher named Mr. Beeman, who was a really
John, I'm gonna have to ask you. Can you get closer to your mic? 'Cause
okay.
you're very soft.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, and Mr. Beeman he was my math teacher. Even though I'm bad in math, I really liked him. I looked up to him as a teacher. And also, there was this woman named Jacqueline Dido, who she came in my senior year, and she was our French teacher, and she was our chorus teacher. So she taught choral. She was from New Orleans, and really just kind of took me under her wing and stuff like that. And me and some of my other friends, and she was really formative because she went to Jackson State. And so, at the time, I was wanting to be an artist. I didn't know how to actually be an artist. I was living with my grandparents. I had a falling out with my mother and my stepfather, but my mom was still my guardian, right? And so she didn't want me to go to art school. She was like, I'd rather you go to the military or something like that. And so it stuck with me. So I actually ended up going to the Army first.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I was stationed at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, but I was in an accident that actually messed my foot up, and so I actually have a piece of steel in my right foot, and we never had this conversation. Never mind.
No.
So yeah, and so what happened? It was like the universe was like, you literally on the wrong path. I mean,
Yeah.
even my drill sergeants were like, Private Jennings, why are you here? They're like, you should be in an art school. What is wrong with you? And I remember like convalescing in the military hospital, and I got in touch with Jackson State. And because a lot of HBCUs have late intake processes, right? I was still able to get a full ride to Jackson State. And I signed my scholarship papers with my leg in traction in a hospital,
Yeah.
And so this was 1988, 1989. So I, went into the freshman, class of 1989 at Jackson State. So, and it's because Madame Dido, who I looked up to, went to Jackson State. And I was like, oh, and then she ended up teaching at Tougaloo. She taught at Tougaloo as well.
Okay.
Yeah. So, she was very much into Black culture. She was very much into like, spaces of resistance, particularly through music and like, gospel music. And like, that was the first time I actually heard the Negro National Anthem, was because we had to sing it for school, stuff like that, So these were formative things.
Mm-hmm.
But I really say like some of the more political spaces is like, there was one particular point where the Ku Klux Klan wanted to march on Jackson when I was at Jackson State. And we were like, we were going to mount a counter protest, counter march, and so they backed down. I remember this had to be like 1990 or something like that, And also we did a sit-in. Probably my first sit-in to protest like them hiking our tuition up a little bit more.
Right.
But Jackson State, of course, is a HBCU, historically Black college in Jackson, Mississippi, founded 1877 in Natchez, Mississippi, and then ends up moving, later on in the 1970s to Jackson. First was Jackson State College, and then became Jackson State University. but it was basically created to to educate freed slaves essentially. And this is after the contraband camp travesty that happens in like in Natchez, Mississippi, which is like in the Devil's Punch Bowl, where like thousands of slaves died. That whole piece.
Right.
So former slaves. But honestly, Sonia, I think really when I got super politicized was when I went to grad school. Because that was the first time I realized that I came to University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign for grad school, like yourself, right?
Yeah.
And that was the first time I thought about myself as a quote unquote minority. You know what I'm saying? It was the first time I realized, like, that was the first time I realized like how little we had and how much we deserved. You know what I'm saying?
Let me ask you, were you the only Black student in your program?
No, because I came with Chalmers Mayors. I came up with Chalmers.
So
But
two of y'all.
for him, if it wasn't for him, I would have been. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I was the only.
Yeah, because we came as a pair. Well, so what happened was that's another person I looked up to is Anderson Macklin. He was a department chair. He studied at Penn State, and he had friends who were actually in the art department at the time. And he basically pulled a few strings, and they came and they gave us a free ride to come check out the campus, and we ended up in graduate school. And both of us ended up going back to Jackson State and teaching. Actually, Chalmers is still there. And the other thing I wanted to say really quickly, as far as like classes, is that Dr. Macklin made it so it was mandatory that we had to have 2 Black art history classes. You see, that's something that was not taught at the University of Illinois at the time. So many artists that I realized they were not even being exposed to. So that's kind of like where I was in a nutshell. But I want to say, like, the first time I thought about stereotypes or like how people were seeing me or like being uncomfortable or thinking about perceived lack or oppression was when I went to grad school. And I think that trajectory helped push me into, it started me off on my journey, and my training isn't in like political science or like African American studies or anything like that. I'm an artist, and what's happened is I had to learn about, the history of visual art through this Afrocentric lens and actually start thinking about it. But I was always interested in comics and the power of that medium, So yeah, so that's it in a nutshell. Hope I wasn't too verbose.
No. Believe me, this is what I want. I want the audience to have a sense of who they're listening to. Better to interact with. So comics, obviously played a large part in your awakening. And you mentioned the Monica Rambeau character. Can you? At what age were you when you became attracted to comics, and at what point did you start to question some of the images?
Oh, those are two. Wow. Okay. So I want to say that I know I wasn't 10 years. It had to be like maybe 8, maybe something like that. I'm trying to think about when I first started thinking about comics. It was my mother that gave me my first comic books. My mom loved the fact that I loved to read so much, And so she was trying to figure out ways to support that reading and keep it going, you know what I'm saying? And she knew I was really interested in folk tales and like things like that. So she got me stuff like the Mighty Thor, right? Or like Spider-Man and like Batman and stuff like that. And so she saw the connection, and I saw the connection between like, Mighty Thor and something like, the actual Norse mythology, you know what I'm saying? So that's where I started. But after that, though, I started reading anything that looked like a comic book. I'm talking like Hot Stuff, Casper, Archie comics. I was really into the medium, And the other thing, early on,
were you attracted to the stories or the art?
A little bit of both. I mean, I think the art was the thing that got me going, and then I like the stories too. The action adventures things, the colors, the costumes, the simplicity of the images, stuff like that really attracted me. At the time, I had an uncle, my Uncle Willie, Albert, who passed fairly recently, who was an artist at the time. And he would actually he was a truck driver. And so sometimes he would stay with us. And so but he was a very talented artist. And so he could draw anything that he saw, right? And at the time, Spider-Man was being drawn by Ross Andrew. As you recall, he's like the artist that took up drawing Spider-Man like after John Romita Sr., I think. But beautiful style. And my Uncle Willie could draw it just like that, just by looking at it, it was really just really that good. And I remember one time he was home, he was tired, and I asked him to draw Spider-Man. He was like, "Man, go draw it yourself." And I was like, "All right, I will." So, and I think that's kind of like that's the kind of like little kid in me that was like, "All right, I'm gonna do it." And so I started to draw Spider-Man very badly, but I got better. So
Yeah.
yeah, so that I think that was part of it. And then I actually fell in love with symbolism. I was always interested in images, from a
Mhm.
very early age. My mom had a lot of books on like psychology and like, from her school, because she went to Alcorn State University. She didn't finish, she was in literature and she didn't finish, but you know, she still had all the books. And so I started
Right.
reading Edgar Allan Poe and like, Shakespeare and stuff super early, probably way too early actually. But my mom was always into comics and to like horror movies and like adventure stories. And
Mm.
she had a really active imagination, and we would watch a lot of stuff together. Like we watched a lot of horror movies together, talk about them. She was really into like, or she is. I'm sorry, she is really into um, detective stories and stuff like that. So actually, that's why I got my love of crime fiction and stuff like that.
Mhm.
Other, so I always mess with her now. It's like we still just talk about horror movies and comics and stuff now. So
Okay.
yeah.
So I'm not sure that many in our audience read or read comic books or
Hmm.
even contemporary graphic novels, but I want to go back to this piece that you did with Francis Gateward, who was also a colleague of ours at
That's right.
Illinois back in the day.
Yeah.
And y'all co-edited The Blacker the Ink, which was an Eisner Award-winning publication. But I want to pick up two things here. One, can you historicize the depiction of Black folk, Black superheroes within
Okay.
the mainstream comics, Marvel, DC, from the earliest appearance of Black characters in the 1930s down to today, but with an emphasis on the 70s
Okay.
and forward, right? Because
Okay.
that's when they introduced Black characters, or at
That's
least
right.
they introduced more,
Yep.
the bulk of. And then the second piece here is because we always got to have critique, right? So there's a response on the part of Black folk to the images that are
Mhm.
being put out in mainstream comics. And early on, there's the all Negro comics, and then in the 80s and 90s, there's a Milestone, and of
That's right.
course, the work that you're doing now. Can
Mhm.
you talk about the counter heroic images that Black folks create in response to the depictions in mainstream comics?
That's a great question. Great question. So first of all, there's a lot of contention around what a superhero is.
Yeah.
Of course, you do have like Peter Coogan's book, "Superhero: The Secret Genre of Secret History of a Genre," or something like that. It actually states, tropes or whatever they
Yeah.
kind of designate it. you know. But you also have characters like the Phantom, which is like created like with 1935 or so by Lee Falk, that predates Superman. But to a lot of us, Superman in the comic books would be the first superhero, right? As far as like fully realized, right? But now, of course, you have like even from like the early as the 1920s or like 1920s, 1930s. There's a character called Bungleton Green, that has been cited as like a proto black superhero.
Prototype. Yeah.
Yeah, which was published in the for many years in the Chicago Defender, and in fact, they just put out a collection of those. There was
Mm.
this artist. Yeah, you're gonna love it. It's like it just came out like a couple of days ago.
Okay. Okay.
And so yeah, there was this brother named Jay Johnson, right, who actually was from Ohio, who ended up doing a lot of work with some of the science fiction magazines back in the day, like Amazing Stories,
Hmm.
stuff like that. So when he took over the strip, because you have to realize, like Bungleton Green was it was a comedy strip. It was kind of like Beetle Bailey or like that kind of thing, right? And so when he takes it over, he turns it into a sci-fi strip for a few years, right? And
Okay.
he puts this action adventure spin on it, and he has these little kids that I think might be inspired by the Young Allies from Marvel.
Hmm.
Well, they had a
From
ring.
Atlas, right?
Yeah, that's right, Atlas, exactly. And so they had this ring that could call up this African prince to protect them. And I was like, excuse me? And so they just put these together. So he kind of is like a pre. superhero, but this is put out by a Black newspaper. This is a Black character created by Black people that presupposes or prefigures,
Right, right. So he's
yeah,
not responding to, well, he probably is responding to other venues in which
that's right.
the negative depictions, minstrelsy, that
That's
kind
right.
of thing, but
Exactly.
not yet in the comics
That's right.
itself.
And so a lot of stuff is coming from exactly from those spaces, right? Because if you look at a character like Whitewash Jones,
Yeah.
right?
Oh boy.
Yeah, which honestly, and it's funny, and I'll talk about this a little bit later. Me and my friend Angelique Roche are working on a book called My Superhero is Black for Marvel and Simon and Schuster, where there was an issue where Marvel actually what do you call it? Reconcile that character, figure out a way to reconcile that character. It's very interesting work because what starts to happen is that when you see how derogatory and offensive that image is, because he essentially Whitewash Jones was coming from like the minstrelsy piece. He
Yeah.
was he
He's a
was
cool.
speaking he was a cool character. He was speaking out of broken English. His superpower was that he always got captured, essentially. you know, Captain America and Bucky would always saving him and stuff.
Yeah.
He was talking about some ghostesses and all this kind of stuff. It was really bad. And then you also had characters like Steamboat, which was a Fawcett character from that same era, which is like 1930, like 1930s, 1940s. He was a Shazam character that I recently came across. I was like, man, same Steamboat, same kind of thing. Giant lips, very, very much in the in that old school minstrelsy piece, which again was being proliferated by advertising as well, because people realized that a lot of these stereotypes were coming out of perceptions of Black people selling products, that kind of stuff, like Gold Dust Twins and stuff like that.
That's how they were able to sell the product. There was
That's right.
something comforting to white people to see us in those images.
That's correct. That's correct. And also stuff like soap, for instance. Oh, you can't get the blackness off. These really like offensive aspects about like what they deem to be like unfortunate Black people, that kind of stuff. So that jumps into the comics. So for instance, you do have a character like called the Spirit, who was created by Will Eisner, again like 1939, 1940, something like that. It had to be in that era because I know he went to the military, so it's probably like late 30s or whatever. Great character, the Spirit. Will Eisner. The Eisner Award is named after him. He's one of the most inventive, comic book creators in America. But he had this extremely offensive character called Ebony White. That looked like honestly like a simian. He looked like a monkey or something. We don't even know if he was human or not, right? And so and this is essentially, he's apologized for it many times since then before he passed, but he was basically mimicking how Black people were being depicted. Then of course you jump a little bit, and so there was a character that I came across on this site about like public domain characters, because unfortunately, like after the Second World War, a lot of these characters fell into the public domain because of the a lot of issues, because people didn't want to read superheroes anymore because of their connections with the Second World War's propaganda, you see. So there was this character, there's this called the Bronze Man, that was created by a Black cartoonist named A.C. Hollingsworth, who was also a member of Spiral later on, the Black abstract art collective. But as a young man, he created this character called the Bronze Man that they whitewashed. 1945 or so, right? The Bronze Man, he was he was kind of a Superman analog. And this is in mainstream comics. I forgot what comic it was, but this is like like one of the competitors to like DC or something like that. And they didn't make him a Black character. He's supposed to be a Black character, but they printed him as a white character, and he was called the Bronze Man. That's 1945 or so. 1947 is when we get All Negro Comics, right? Which is created by Orrin C. Evans and his brother and a couple other people out of Philly. That is the first collection of multiple genres of comic books in one collection. It is the first ever. It featured characters like Ace Harlem, which was like a detective character called Lion Man, who kind of prefigures the Black Panther. Actually, the Lion Man is really interesting because first of all, that's his name. His name is Lion Man. He doesn't have a He's a Black scientist. He's a Black scientist who was sent to the Gold Coast of Africa by the United Nations to protect a magical mountain of uranium from poachers. from colonizers.
That's interesting.
I'm like, what? Yeah, so I sent you. I don't know if you got a chance to check it, but one of the pieces I've refigured Lion Man because all the characters in that book are like public domain because it's created in 1947. So people have been kind of rethinking like how these characters are coming across.
Right.
So isn't that interesting though? That's like
Yeah.
quite a few years before 1966 when the Black Panther comes out.
Right.
Really interesting, right? So all those characters are public domain, but what happens is, and I think this is how I jumped off, is that once the mainstream, the white mainstream, saw what's happening with that book, they would not sell them paper and ink and stuff like that to print another issue. So for we understand, the second issue was put together, but it went out of business because they couldn't get the materials, right? Of course, Orrin C. Evans goes on to become a very like an award-winning, legendary Black newspaper man. You know, so he goes on and does that. But the comic is now it's a shame because what happens with that is that could have been the start of a really, really robust Black independent comics, you know, space that we don't see grow until the 1990s. Like you said, you don't really see that. And so what happens is like the cartoons, they go into like the the Black press, you know?
Right.
So that's why you see people like, you know, Maury Turner and
the only place they can have an audience and where they're remunerated for their work.
Exactly.
You know, that's a white capitalist strategy. I mean, that's why Stax was ultimately destroyed.
Yeah.
You know, we can go on and on in terms of those ventures that white capitalists saw as competition.
That's right.
And they strangled them.
That's right. They strangled it off and say, "Oh, we won't give you no supplies," you know, because the book was obviously a success. They charged a little bit more for it. So that's 1947. You really, really see a dearth of Black characters. I mean, a lot of times you're seeing like these, problematic like African constructs, like, you know, and these Africa comics, you know, like jungle comics and stuff, right?
Yeah.
A lot of times you have a white protagonist, you know,
which reflect jungle movies.
That's right.
You know, that genre.
That's right.
Absolutely.
That's right. Yeah, and so even Marvel, you know, was getting down with that kind of stuff with some like jungle action even. But there's a character called like, you know, Prince Waku, I think, of the Bantu or something like that, where it's centered on a Black character. Then of course you have stuff like Voodoo, which was created by Matt Baker, who was a Black cartoonist. This is you know, he was supposed to be like a Black character, but you really couldn't tell. Sometimes he looked like he, you know, had a conch or something, you know. So you know, these are them playing around with these tropes and stuff. But a lot of times you really just see characters like Lothar, who was a king who worked as a lackey for like Mandrake the Magician. I mean, you have these, you know, tributaries. Right. Could be a great character. But you know, what's really interesting though, and this is something I thought was really fascinating, 1950, and it's not a comic book, but this is comic strips. The Pittsburgh Courier, 1950, they paid a white Jewish like journeyman collective called the Smith Man Association to design for them 4 genre characters. A Black cowboy character called the Chisholm Kid, like the Chisholm Trail, right? A character called Mark Hunt, who was a detective character, right? A Black spy character, Sunyata, called Guy Fortune, right? He was a James Bond.
Yeah.
And essentially a black spaceman character that is almost like a Flash Gordon. His name was Neil Knight. 1950, 1954, these characters were coming out through the Pittsburgh Courier to a Black audience, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, what? And so right now, there's these 2 sisters. They have this thing called the Museum of Uncut Funk. They actually have control of these characters. And I've been working with them to build out these characters. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So a lot of my stuff that I'm doing is reclamation of the history of the characters, right? So then we make a really serious jump to say, like, you know, 1960 or so, we get a character like Gabriel Jones, right?
Yeah.
Who was part of the Howling Commandos, which was kind of like inspired by stuff like, you know, the Black Hawks, or like, you know, those old school, like, you know, 1940s Terry and the Pirates, those like, you know, those army comics, right? But it was like a collective of like different people from different backgrounds, and so he was a trumpet player.
Cold War propaganda.
Yeah, Cold War propaganda, exactly. So he was a trumpet player, and he called him Gabriel, and so he was part of the Howling Commandos. And Nick Fury, you know, who at the time was white,
Right.
You know? Nick Fury Senior, because you know, in the comics, Nick Fury Jr. is Black, right? That's how they fixed it. So, So yeah, so that was a thing. And then of course, with black exploitation, with these ideas around black, black aesthetics, maybe even influenced a little bit by some of the black arts movement to a certain degree. If
Oh
people,
yeah, yeah,
yeah, you get a character like Black Panther. And so um which is 1966, and he debuts in Fantastic Four and number 52. And in the story, the Fantastic Four, which at the time is Marvel Comics' #1 selling book, right?
yeah.
Yep, gets a communication from Wakanda, this secret village where what they think is like just full of like shepherds and
Right, right.
textile makers and stuff like that, right? And Reed Richards is like, where do they get this sophisticated technology from? And of course, they go there and they realize that there's this technological jungle, and they
Yeah.
get attacked by the Black Panther, and he whoops the heck out of them as a test, right?
Right,
Because
right.
he wants to test his mettle to go up against his the villain Ulysses Claw, who killed his father. So, but Wakanda, of course, is like, as we know now, is like this secret technologically advanced society who has access to this amazing metal from outer space
Right.
called vibranium, which absorbs sound and vibration.
Sound like uranium to make
Right.
the
So I'm
point.
saying
Yeah,
exactly. So now I'm like, people are like, that's really interesting. Anyway,
yeah.
so yeah, and so of course, what's interesting about it is that the antecedents to those things are like these jungle comics and stuff like that, where you see savages, right? This is the
Right.
opposite, where you see like an amalgamation of what they think of like African adjacent practices and stuff like that. They did their best to kind of make an amalgam country that is the most technologically advanced country in the world, right? And the richest as well.
Right.
And these people are brilliant and beautiful. And so it was just something that you had never seen before. And what's really interesting about it is that people responded to it well. You know that, right? Like there weren't a lot of people that were like against this. There was actually people who really liked the
Right.
Black Panther. So he actually took off because what happens is in the 1970s, Captain America sponsored him to join the Avengers.
Right.
So he actually was very prominent in the 1970s before he gets into general action and you get the Don McGregor run and stuff. But then of course you have other characters like Sam Wilson, the Falcon, 1968. There no 68. Yeah, I think that's
No,
right.
no, no, no.
No,
I think Sam
69. Maybe
Wilson.
69.
No, I think it's in the mid-70s, man.
No. I think it's. I
Oh,
want to say because I want to say 60. It's still in
well,
the 60s,
you
but
you
it's
might be right on the Falcon. I'm
yeah,
just
the
thinking that
Falcons.
it's in the mid-70s when you get Cage,
Yeah,
Blade, and all of
that's a
Storm
response
and
to
all of that. Yeah.
that's right because that's a response to black exploitation films
Right.
essentially.
Right.
Yeah, so Luke Cage, who you just mentioned, who was like a ex-con who gets experimented on, while he's in prison, right in Seagate prison. He lets himself get experimented on to maybe shave off some time off his sentence. A racist guard, actually like messes with the experiment and out trying to kill him. But creates a superhero essentially, a new powerful body. That we see in Marvel Comics, and he's like the first like mainstream black character to have a mainstream book that is his own, essentially.
Yeah.
And occasionally, of course, like the Falcon, he starts out as a Captain America's, not just a sidekick, friend, what
Yeah.
have you, but he ends up becoming his own hero, and now actually wears the mantle of Captain America, along with Steve Rogers, actually. So, what's interesting about the Falcon though is they retconned
Yeah.
his origin, which was a hot mess because it started off as him being like a good dude who was good with
Right.
birds and
Right.
whatever.
He's
They
supposed
made
to
him
be.
into a drug dealer and a pimp and all this kind of stuff to kind of respond again to that black exploitation thing. Later, of course, you have characters like Tyrock and from the Legion of Superheroes who actually had a really interesting power, but was like very stereotyped. He could his voice could like change reality. He could actually do different things with his voice, through singing or like shouting or whatever,
Mhm.
which is actually a really interesting power for a black man to have, that his voice could actually shift reality. But the way they portrayed him was so stereotypical, it was just, it was bad.
Yeah.
But you also have characters like Storm, like you said, 1975, right? Who is one of the X-Men. She's can control the weather. I think a lot of people know the X-Men these days. Her 50th anniversary is coming up pretty
Right.
soon, The other thing too, and this is a little known fact, the first black woman superhero is actually the Butterfly. 1971. Published by Skywald Publishing, also in the public domain, by the way, because of the copyright notice. They don't put the right copyright on it. So I'm actually doing a redo of that character because no one's messed with it. 50 years old, and no one's done anything with it. She was a singer actually that would at night go out and beat up racists. So yes, it's created again. It's created by white men. It's created by white men. Yeah, they were doing some really interesting things. Of course, you had people like Don McGregor writing for Black Panther. You also get some really interesting villains. Like in 1968, we actually had the first Black supervillain, Centurious. He appears in Nick Fury, I think #3. And it's kind of squandered actually, because he actually is like a really brilliant scientist. He's about to like destroy the world and repopulate with his own creations, and he had this kind of like James Bond style like Island of Dr. Moreau thing going, and they just kind of squander it. He could have been a really big villain, for Marvel, but he's a great villain though, So we had so those
much of what you've described are Marvel characters.
Yeah.
But DC was the dominant company in the 50s and 60s.
That's correct.
And I don't think Marvel succeeds them until the mid 70s, maybe.
That's right. Probably because of X-Men.
Where are the Black characters in terms of DC?
DC would probably
Why were they so late?
Here's the thing. I mean, they are the classic, kind of white bread character. A lot of people look at them as like those were the comics that your dad would have been reading, where you're reading. Marvel was for the teenagers, so they were a little bit behind the times. So of course, their first Black superhero was John Stewart. That wasn't until like what 1971.
Late 70s.
Right?
Late 70s.
Yeah, because I know that Black Lightning wasn't until 1977. I know that because he was like one of the last, he's an original Black character to have his own title created by Tony Isabella and Trevor Von Eaton. That's 1977. But then you have a character like, I think it's called like Valmar or Val. Okay, I forgot. I keep forgetting his name, but he's a character that was part of Teen Titans, actually. Bumblebee was his girlfriend, and there's also Nubia, of course. They had that actually Wonder Woman's sister who's made out of darker clay. Vixen is actually also in the 1970s, a character from Africa that can actually mimic different animal powers. So again they start to kind of jump on that Blaxploitation thing later, but that's where they were. I want to say that I want to say that their first Black character though was John Stewart, which is the alternative Green Lantern.
Right.
Yeah. And of course, you jump way fast into like you said, the late 80s and such, where you do have the answer to a lot of those things. Because they're still like, even though those are characters that were kind of sometimes co-created by black people, like I think like a little bit, I have a character like Black Goliath that I think was actually co-created by a Black man. I think it's Tony Isabella and somebody and a Black artist, maybe like Billy Graham or somebody. The other thing too is you have like writers like Christopher Priest, who start writing, in the late 80s, right? The first thing he writes is a Falcon miniseries, actually, when he was still Jim Owsley. I remember that quite distinctly, actually, because I really liked the Falcon, and he wrote the first miniseries, but it was starring the Falcon, in the 80s. But you do see like a pushback from like the independents, right? Where you have people who grew up reading stuff like ourselves, like the X-Men and Avengers and stuff, but not seeing ourselves reflected in those spaces. And so we said, you know what, we're going to do it ourselves, right? So you have someone like Tertel Lee, who's out of Chicago, who creates what they call the Black Age of comics. He's like, well, we got the Golden Age, you got the Bronze Age, the Silver Age. What about the Black Age, right? He gets inspired by none other than Mobius while he's in Paris, and he comes back and he coins the term the Black Age of comics, and he starts the first Afrocentric comic book convention in Chicago. This is like 93, actually. And then you have like a bunch of Black film that's being made in that era that I think is influenced, stuff like Julie Dash's work. You have stuff like Sankofa that comes out in the 90s, stuff like that. Things like, what else? No, that's not till later. The Eve's Bio is much later. But still, though, you do have like these influx of like Black filmmakers that I think are also affecting, Black comics and stuff. So
Basically,
Afrofuturism.
the L.A. Rebellion School of Black
That's right.
filmmakers.
That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
So you have people like, then of course the term Afrofuturism gets coined in the '90s. Then you have like the influx of like cyber culture and stuff like that. You have characters like Deathlock, where like Dwayne McDuffie and like
yeah,
Dennis Cowan actually create that character before the term Afrofuturism even coined. That's like 3 years before, stuff like
mm,
that. Very
mm.
Afrofuturist. Um,
Speaking of Deathlock, and then I want to move us on, but
yeah, because we could talk about
that
comics all
classic comic,
night.
The Soul of Cyberfolk,
Yes, yeah.
that just remains a seminal piece.
Oh, it's honestly between that, which is excellent because he kind of posits like cybernetic people as black people.
Right.
Obviously, he's heavily quoting Du Bois in those
Yeah.
He heavily quotes him.
Yeah.
He was but even with that, he's even looking like Fanonian triple consciousness, even what I'm saying, where you have like a black what do you call it? He's anti-violent. He's a
Right. Right.
pacifist who is a computer programmer whose brain gets put into a death machine, right?
Yeah.
So you have three bodies. You have like his physical body, you have his mind inside a death-like body, and then he can actually travel through cyberspace.
Right. Right.
Three black consciousness or three representations of this black man, that's actually fighting for his identity in these three different ways. It's just really brilliant, Anyway, but yeah, so that leads into a lot of the 1990s, Afrofuturist comics, like stuff that was being made by Milestone, like Static Shock and Icon and Rocket, and Blood Syndicate, things of that nature. And then also have stuff like from Ania comics, like Hero and
Hero. Yeah.
Hero, and also stuff like what's the name of it, Purge, stuff like that are coming out of that space.
So let me
Brother Man.
cut your chest and get you to sum up something for me.
Yeah.
In terms of the efforts on the part of African Americans to produce an independent or semi-independent, in the case of Milestone, I mean, they had creative control, but ultimately they were under the thumb of a DC. What would you say? Do you see that as a parallel movement to the Black Arts movement?
Thank you for that. Yes, because I know one of the things you want to unpack was like this notion of the Black speculative arts movement, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things, I was looking at this resurgence of Afrofuturism. Like I said, Afrofuturism is coined in like the early '90s, kind of like ebbs and flows, and really comes to bear, in the early 2000s. You know what I'm saying, like 2007, 2008, and it actually has been a undercurrent that is like burst. I think like films like Get Out and the Black Panther kind of like made it go like just burst out, everywhere. Yeah. We had been thinking about it for like a decade or so. So I started seeing that a lot of ground, on the ground grassroots organizers, right, were also writing science fiction and thinking about futuristic spaces and stuff like that. So if you look at like a book like Octavia's Brood, which was a collection put together by Adrienne Marie Brown and Walida Amarisha, they're all science fiction stories that are written by Black activists, or activists, right? Okay. And I thought that was really interesting, right? Because they're fighting for the future, but also creating stories about the future, right? And there's another one that came out of Detroit. It was like Detroit. I forgot what the date was, but it was like thinking about like future Detroit spaces, right? And of course, you also have like the explosion of like interest in like Black futures and Black lives with like the Ferguson protests and Mike Brown and the piece Trayvon Martin, the rise of like this new focus on like Black futures, I think they kind of coalesced together. And so I was like, let's just call it what is 2015. I said, well, this is kind of like the Black speculative arts movement, because if you look at like the Harlem Renaissance, for instance, there's a lot of speculative fiction being written, if you think about it, like stuff like The Conjure Woman, you look at like George Schuyler's work in particular.
Oh yeah.
Especially if you look at something like Black Empire.
That's
science fiction. You know what I'm saying? That's but then you look at Du Bois, right? Du Bois was writing science fiction. The comet still predates the coinage of the term science fiction, 1920, right? 1929 was when science fiction as a term was created by Hugo back. That's it's 1929. But when they found the Princess Steel, that's what really sold it for me, because Princess Steel was written in 1905, where he was probably transitioning from Atlanta to New York to work for the NAACP, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's about right. I think because
But no. He wouldn't move to New York until I think 1909.
that's what I'm
That's
saying.
when
So
he
it was 19. So it was in
yeah.
that it was. So some people
He's still at Atlanta.
he's still in Atlanta. That's what I'm saying. So he's still in Atlanta in 1905, but they don't know exactly if he wrote it in 1905 or 1909. But it's in his paper, and it's a book about. I mean, excuse me. It's a short story about this couple that go to this viewing of a new device called a megascope, and he uses it as a framing mechanism to talk about his critiques of the U.S. steel industry. And I was like, "Excuse me," but it's straight up sci-fi. It's like a straight up like out of Amazing Stories or something. And that's why I call my imprint Megascope. That's why I got the name from.
Yeah, I picked it up.
Yeah, so that's part of. I think the Black Spectrum. I think comics have not been. They haven't been paid attention to as much, because if you look at like the first piece on Afrofuturism, which is in 1993 by Mark Derry, he goes out of his way to posit that Milestone Media and those Black comics are part of Afrofuturism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you think about it, you look at that article, there's 5 images in there, right, that he uses to illustrate it. One is an image by Rem LZ, the hip hop star, right? Okay. 2 images from Kyle Baker's Why I Hate Saturn, and then 2 images from Milestone. So he's already.
Which images from Milestone?
He had an image of Hardware, which actually, if you look at the article, juxtaposes his definition of Afrofuturism. And then you also have Icon and Rocket. Icon's alien, who becomes Black, when he gets to Earth. And, it's like, yeah. Anyway, so I think that's where we are. I think that we're in a space now where you've had this resurgence of Black speculative thought. And what's interesting about it is that it's become more of a global space. Like, it's actually a lot because of the way that we're connected through the internet and all these different things. And also the ubiquitous nature of how we make things. Like, for instance, Photoshop and layout programs and printing on demand, all this stuff didn't exist back in the day. But now you can actually you and I could actually come up with a project, lay it out and print it and put it out ourselves and distribute it. That's a very different space we live in, so
it creates a real possibility of alternative and independent workers. So let me shift you to an interview that you did in 2014.
Okay.
And I was intrigued. The context is you're discussing Afrofuturism, and the interviewer is querying you about Afrofuturism as a means of making sense of Black folk reality. And you responded by saying, I wonder if it's more in line with creating a new world instead of making sense of this one. I want you to elaborate on that, because I thought that was most profound response.
So, I'm trying to think about, because you and I, love Julian, great, wonderful scholar. And I think what I was probably grappling with was the fact that even back to those writers we're talking about, a lot of the writing from, even before like the Harlem Renaissance was about a new space, right? A space of freedom, a space that was not linked to this oppressive space, right? So you look at something like Light Ahead for the Negro, which was put in the 1800s, Blake, Mark Delaney, Pauline Hopkins of One Blood, where she actually talks about a secret Ethiopian space that is untouched, is magical, and this is before Wakanda, right? Way before Wakanda.
Right. This is in the early 1900s.
1900s, that's right. So so we've all, and then of course, if you want to jump a little bit, you come to like these musical orchestral spaces like Boogie Wonderland and like Ghetto Heaven and all these different spaces, or even something like Space is the Place, where you have like Sunrise. What Sunrise really talking about is an inner place. He's not really talking about this. Outer space is a metaphor, but he's like, no, if we can't find freedom here, I'm going to take this oppression and do away with it and make a new space for myself. That kind of thing. So I think the idea, the conflation of space and race and about freedom is something I was thinking about. I think when I said that, because I noticed that the construction of a not necessarily a utopic space, but maybe an Afro-heterotopic space, where it's like, utopias are not really possible, but a space where we are free to make and argue and make the things that we want to make, I think are very possible. And I think that's what I think we're kind of messing around with. And I see that even if you look at something like Nnedi Okorafor's what do you call it? The book she did, Zara the Windseeker. It takes place on a black planet,
Yeah.
right? Or you look at like Larry Fuller's one issue he did, Eben. Eben is descended from a scientist and warrior from a black planet called Nida. You see what I'm saying? So
this is what I want to get at, because
yeah.
When you look at much of film, not so much in literature, but in film, white capitalist culture tends to focus more on dystopian futures. Yet the Afrofuturists seem to lean toward a utopia. And so I'm wondering if you could make sense of that.
And that's a really good point. Now I have to say, like, there are some things that deal with dystopia. Like, for instance, when my Cybertrap space, I use it kind of like Octavia Butler did, where she's talking about, like, if we keep on this road, we're gonna end up in this space. Because my futuristic Mississippi Cybertrap space that I created, it's after many, many tumultuous hurricanes because of global warming and stuff like that. So it's cli-fi, But you're right. I mean, I tend to say that there's a lot of positing of a future space. Even if you look at something in the music, because a lot of times, like, our music was our science fiction, like Kevin Sipp says. And you look at books like More Brilliant Than the Sun, by Kadwa Eshun, where he's looking at, like, science fiction as music. They're soundscapes, right? So we're trying to create a beautiful space to get, to, right? Because if you look again at, like, someone like Sun Ra, if you've seen Space of the Place, it starts out with, it's after the end of the world. Don't you know that yet? It's after the end of the world. So we're talking about something where, like, we're people who have already survived a
dystopia.
We've survived the Ma'afa, you know what I'm saying? And we're here. So, we're going to, I feel that as a Black man in America, coming to how I came up, in the particular space that came up, I don't have time to make things that are going to disrupt us anymore. Even if I'm doing Black horror, I might send that protagonist to live in hell, but you better, I'm gonna spoil it for you. They're gonna win at the end. You know what I'm saying? They're gonna win. So I think that what we're doing with this types of work that has been a European project is to posit themselves at the end of the world. We're flipping that and saying, okay, we can actually still have these speculative spaces, but guess what? We're gonna be in that. We're gonna be surviving. We're gonna be there. And surviving your own oppressor, or surviving a space that's trying to diminish you and destroy you. I think is, man, that's beautiful. I think that's a beautiful space. So I think that's what Afrofuturism is giving us. It's giving us a space where we can actually, through, like, channeling Afrocentric thought, and thinking about the ancestors, technology, all these different ideas, fusing it with a speculative space. You're looking forward and backwards. That's why I had this, right? You're taking from that past. That's what I call Sankofaration, where you're taking Sankofa and you're fusing it with narration, and you're making a new space. But you don't forget where you came from. You don't forget the pain. You don't let it define you.
Right. So let me shift, and this is a question about a serious problem that we're encountering in terms of reading levels, right? Nationally, 85% of Black youth read below grade level. Okay. In Champaign, where I'm at, African-American third graders read, I think 9% of African-American third graders read at level. In the city of Urbana, it's 4%. And if you go through central Illinois, right, where you've got populations of Black people that are somewhere between 25 and 18% of these cities, all of the reading levels are way down, and we're not getting to Chicago and talk about the metropolises, right? So
Yeah.
I'm wondering if this surge of Black material, autobiographies, memoirs, uh, novels, stories, etc., that's appearing in the graphic novel format.
Hmm.
Because I know for me, um, reading comic books were actually comic books were about the only books that I read regularly,
Right.
right? So my vocabulary was stimulated by comic books
Because you go
because
look up.
they actually had words that were more complex and more scientific
Yep.
than what I was reading in school, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Um, is it possible that pedagogically Black graphic novels could open up a space to capture our youth and elevate the reading? That medium that merges images with text might be the thing to really grab our youth.
I think yes. I think yes. And I don't have the data in front of me, but um, so well, first of all, let me comment on the first part. So the heartbreaking thing is that the education system is doing exactly what it's supposed to do.
Yeah.
It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to break you. It's supposed to like indoctrinate you, isolate you. It's not. Education is about like questioning and about like applying the knowledge and stuff.
Mhm.
This is not what our education system has ever been designed to do. So yeah, it's functioning perfectly.
Not
It's
the
not
public,
broken.
but the private education for rich white folks. They're
Yes,
taught to be leaders.
that's
They're
right.
taught to problem solve.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so that's what those other schools do, right? So anyway, so they want to deal with that. So they're reading where they're supposed to be, according to like the the norm, so to speak. So as far as like your question about like you know, comics, man. One of the things that I was really excited about, I'm working with this gentleman named Michael Dando out of Minnesota. He teaches at St. Cloud State University. Um, Brother from another mother, so to speak, but
Mhm.
has invested himself in like educating Black kids, particularly from the inner city, from different spaces of marginalization, and has done studies on like hip hop and comics and things like that. When I first met him, he was working with his brother, this gentleman named Nathan Holbert with the Teachers College. And so they were doing something where they were taking stuff like Wakanda, turning it into a makerspace, actually, and
Mm.
doing research where they're primarily teaching. And me and Stacey Robinson did some work with them in New York. And so now we've actually put together this thing called the Lion Man Literacy Project. And the stuff like the Lion Man comic I sent you and the Mighty Struggle comic I
Right,
sent
right,
you,
right.
they're funded by the United Way along with St. Cloud State University in the state of Minnesota to actually do
Okay.
research on making comics for these kids, right? And he said that there was this one boy that was all like, he was maybe like 12 years old, Black kid that was disaffected. He was like, whatever, right? Gave him the Lion Man comic, couldn't put it down. You know what I'm saying?
Mm.
And so there's something about seeing yourself reflected
Yeah.
that way. These comics are specifically made to empower them, and they know it. So I think yes, I think what you do is you get those kids, have conversations about what they're reading, but engage them on a different level. I just had a sales meeting today with Megascope. Guess what our number one selling book is? It's the book about the Tulsa Race Massacre, right?
Mm.
That's our number one selling book. Second one is by Nadia Corfor and me, right? And we wrote it from a positive standpoint, like this was a horrible thing that happened, but guess what? These people were geniuses. These people were entrepreneurs.
Right,
These people
right.
were historically this space was not supposed to exist. It was Wakanda before there was a damn Wakanda. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah.
but so these are things that I think would empower our youth. I'm very much about that. So I want to make stories for younger kids. We're doing historical books because of that, actually, and
Mhm.
also we're doing like classics. Like one of our next books is an Afrofuturist version of the Count of Monte Cristo,
Oh, good,
set
good.
150 years after the polar ice caps melt off the coast of Africa, so everybody Black.
Mm.
So we're reclaiming the fact that Alexander Dumas was a Black man, right?
And the Three Musketeers were Black.
That's right.
Let's be
Right.
clear.
Let's be clear
Yeah,
about this.
yeah.
Exactly.
Let's be
So
clear. He's
yeah,
writing
so
about his father's life.
that's right. He's talking about his father's life. Exactly. And
That's
see,
right.
these are things that we're writing about in the books. We published a book about Barbados called Hard Ears that was talking about the fact them as a colonized space, but also it's a mystical like adventure story. But it talks about the history. So I think there's a way to do it, and I totally agree with you. I think that it's a powerful medium, But I think the thing is that we are so used to not seeing ourselves as heroes and as the protagonists, but we can do it. And actually, I think the kids do respond really well to it. So, yeah.
Okay, good. So, Wakanda Forever.
Hmm.
I've been, reading takes on it, the Twitterverse, etc.,
It's crazy.
TikTok, and I picked up two trends of the critique. Right.
Right.
One argument is that it places Wakanda on the side of European imperialism, and that the subtext is that two dark nations should not have gone to war. The other train of thought says that it's not just a matriarchal feminist story, but that it's a work of misandry, arguing that it's a straight up attack on Black men. And the pivotal point that this group of folk tend to make is they argue that M'Baku was basically punked by Shuri. So I know you've seen the film.
Yes, I have.
And so what's your analysis of it? And how do you react to those threads?
It's deep, man, because this is a movie that should have not been able even to be made. You know what I'm saying? Because that Ryan Coogler said he wanted to not make any more films after this, after he lost Chadwick.
You got to speak up. You're getting very.
I said so it was a film that I thought like that it was a miracle that was created.
Yeah.
I know how I felt after Chadwick. This was in the middle of the George Floyd protests and everything. I had my sister had passed away a few months before from a sudden heart attack. I was like in a really bad space, and so I remember how bad I felt. To lose this. I mean, to me, I'm someone who studies Afrofuturism. This guy is the pinnacle of Afrofuturism. He's like at the head of it. As far as like, Black Panther is like this, beautiful space. I think one of the things that really makes me sad about the critiques, and some are valid, some maybe not so much. I don't necessarily agree with them, but we can get into that. But I think what it did is like it really, really upends the fact that this was a elegy for a fallen brother, like Chat, so when and I got a chance to just meet Ryan Coogler like this past weekend and actually tell him that he gave us a space to grieve, and that's what the story is about. It's really this other stuff is just kind of icing on the cake. It's really about us letting go of and what it means to actually move on with our lives after we lose someone that we love, and that's what the film's essentially about. This other stuff, the fighting and things. This is just like a Marvel movie, right?
Right.
It's not as important as a whole film that really is dedicated to the loss of a Black man's life. And that's something that is, I think, very poignant. The other thing is that, Ryan Coogler primarily has made his career off of making films about Black men,
Right.
I mean, if you look at his career, it's like,
Real
Station,
Station,
it's all about like him
Creed.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
He makes films about Black men, so he twists the lens a little bit and he focuses on Black women a little bit more. I think that's cool. But not to the detriment of like, the fact that Chadwick Boseman's presence permeated that entire film.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? The other thing is that I really did like what they did at Namor. I mean, I was like Namor, you know what I'm saying? But making him into this like
making him indigenous.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was
and in response to the slave trade,
it was, and also too, it's like, okay, so on one particular piece, I mean, you could see them aligning themselves, I guess, with the European space, but really what it was about was protecting this young Black genius, right? And to a certain degree,
this young African American.
Yes, that's right, young African American.
Because I thought that it was a sense of continental Africans reaching for what they call the lost tribe.
Yes,
So I
and
saw
also
it as powerful in that sense.
that's an interesting. I never thought. Yes, because it's also like a counterpoint to um,
Killmonger.
how they treated Killmonger. That's right.
Right.
Right. So yeah, man, that's yeah, I agree with that. And the fact that this woman, this young lady comes from Chicago, South Side Chicago, is a victim of like gang violence, but it's also a shining. She's like a
Yeah.
brilliant, like she's a genius.
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know,
She's a
and
genius.
actually create. She didn't intend to create this thing to find. She did it as a project. You know what I'm saying? And so that it reminds me of like the team ups in Marvel Comics was like you have two good guys
Mm.
and then they fight it first.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Because if you think about it, at the end of it, Namor was like, yes, the Black Panther had me. She could have killed me. Right. But she knows that at the end of this, these white folk are going to come after us. And you look at the image that he was working on, it was an image of himself or their people connected with the Black Panther. You know what I'm saying? So I think, yes, for the
Yeah.
spectacle of the film, that's what that was. But at the end of it, I think Ryan Coogler sneaked something in there about like, Europeans stealing, you know,
Oh,
uh,
yeah. Oh, yeah.
resources. And I think it was really interesting that they juxtaposed that with Haiti, first Black nation.
Oh, I thought that was a hell of a move.
Man, and then the new Black Panther, of course, that young man is going to be Black Panther one of these days. To name him Toussaint,
Yeah. Yeah.
I was like,
That was all powerful in the way it made those connections.
yeah. So I
Yeah.
can see why people could critique that, but I also feel like there was a lot of subtlety and like I can't believe Disney let him do that kind of stuff. You know what I'm saying? I was like, oh,
Well, see, I could see that Disney let him do Wakanda Forever, but
yeah,
the logic of Wakanda Forever suggests that Tolokan and Wakanda will be fighting the colonizers.
that's what they suggested.
They're they're not letting him
They're
make
not gonna let
that
you make that
movie.
movie,
That movie not getting made.
but that's the movie he's positing, right?
Yeah, yeah. That he
Now,
certainly has set it up for that.
that's right. No. So to answer you about the Misandry piece. So first of all, you know, I love the fact that they have these different women that are doing awesome things. Shuri becomes Black Panther in the comics, as we know, during the
Right.
Christopher Priest run and stuff like that. M'Baku is a really interesting character to me because, as you know, like in the
Yes.
comic books, highly stereotypical
Yeah.
in a white gorilla suit.
Right.
And
Right.
he was one of T'Challa's biggest foes in 1970s, actually, right?
Yeah. He
So
may have been the biggest foe.
that's right. He was in the
All
1970s for
defeated. Yeah.
sure. He was in the comic, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So what they do with M'Baku is M'Baku does not have superpowers. M'Baku is the strongest non-powered being in those films.
Right.
So in order to show how adept someone is or how powerful they are, they have to defeat him. You know, so that's the thing. So for instance, like in the first film, where he is barely beaten by T'Challa, by the way, T'Challa was about to get thrown off the
Right. Right.
but he does beat him, right? And so he has to show like M'Baku is the most powerful, right? Second thing is like in the Wakanda Forever piece, Namor hits him too. Namor actually,
Oh, yeah.
Namor is superhuman, right? He
Right.
is not a normal person. He's
Right.
very powerful. So in order to show how powerful Namor is, you have to take out the most powerful non-powered being.
Right.
Same thing with Shuri, right? So Shuri, has now taken the
Heart-shaped
herb,
herb.
which means that she is now. He has to, basically. It's almost like when they did that whole like grappling thing. That was her seeking his approval. I'm strong enough to be the Black Panther now, and he says yes. She is the Black Panther now. That kind of thing. So the other thing that's interesting about M'Baku is that T'Challa trusts him enough to become part of the council again, right? You notice that he's not an outsider anymore. He calls himself a son of Wakanda, right? And Wakanda needs him. What does he do? Does he turn his back on them? No. He embraces them. He says, come with me into the mountains, and I will protect you, right? That's what a man does. I think a man does that, So I was looking. So I think a lot of things, because we're looking at like comics are about hyperbolic masculinity with fighting, this kind of stuff.
Right.
There's
that's what struck me is
yeah,
that was M'Baku who came to understand that you don't want to kill him
that's right.
because then we're going to have permanent war.
exactly. And he wants
And
peace.
so it took a character that had just been all physicality
That's right.
and now made him a very smart individual
Wise.
and
Wise counsel.
wise.
That's right.
And so I thought that was a brilliant move in humanizing M'Baku
He's the one of my favorite
and
characters.
bringing balance.
His arc is beautiful to me. His arc
Yeah,
is beautiful, and I feel bad for people to think that he is not masculine. I think that they're looking at these very, very hard edges around. Like no, he's a father figure. He actually is counseling Shuri in her lowest point. He also stands by her when he knows that she's wrong,
yeah.
and he also
And
says,
ultimately, he's right.
and also
That's
he's
the
right,
other thing.
and
It's
that's
his
why.
analysis that's correct.
That's right, and that's why she sets him up as what? As king.
Yeah,
She doesn't. She knows she's not ready to be a leader yet. She sends him to the falls.
right.
He comes off of her flagship. She's in Haiti. He
That's right.
goes at the end. He said, "Who gonna challenge me? M'Baku about to be king." You
Right.
know what I'm saying? So, and he deserves to be because he's the character that actually showed the most growth to me. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
I think his arc was beautiful. So I don't know. It makes me feel bad about like because when they say stuff like that, they really upend this really wonderful black man's work. You know what I'm saying? This was how difficult was it? And I told him, I don't know how you did it. That's why I said I got a chance to talk to this person. I don't know how you did that to shoulder that and actually like put all those moving pieces together. I mean, working for Disney is difficult because there's such a huge, piece. And so he still slipped in all this beautiful stuff for us, man. So I thought it was wonderful personally. I thought it was transcendent, and very, very different type of Marvel movie that you wouldn't get. And we had to lose Chadwick to see something like that. But I don't know how he did it to this day. And it's beautifully done. You see us up for, I mean, he's breaking all these records, and Hannah Beekler, I think, is up for who's a wonderful set designer. And then Ruth Carter is killing it. I mean, it's black excellence at its pinnacle. Angela Bassett with her beautiful arms was murdering every scene.
Yeah.
Man, and that scene where she dresses down Okoye,
Yeah.
I felt that in my soul. I was like, man,
Hey.
that was something to see.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Undoubtedly.
Yeah, and then they gave us T'Challa. They did recast T'Challa. They gave us his son.
So let me throw this out there at you.
Yeah.
In my mind,
got me like all jacked up.
Wakanda is the Congo.
Yeah.
And so having the French mercenaries, right, to me was saying, okay, we know this is a role that these cats played
That's a good
and
point.
have consistently played in intervening in Africa while the U.S. has kind of laid back and manipulated things. So I thought that showed some keen insight.
That was really bold. And they had to people forget, Kugler's coming out of Oakland. He's coming out of those traditions.
Right.
He's coming out of those he's straight up he was still working for San Francisco while he was making Fruitvale Station. You know that, right? His father was part of the union there. They worked. They helped build that city. You know what I'm saying? So there's a lot of that in there.
Yeah.
So don't get it twisted. And I was also thinking about the way that they use Everett Ross.
Yeah.
So he becomes, because they don't have Hunter, the white.
I don't think the White Wolf. I don't think
they don't have the White Wolf.
introduced it. But remember they were going to make Bucky the White Wolf.
Yeah, that's right.
And then they pulled back from that.
Yeah, but I thought that was because the White Wolf is a very interesting character because he's almost like a takedown of Tarzan. You know what I'm saying? Which is really interesting to me. But I think that Everett Ross, they kind of turned him into like the white spook to sit by the door. Because what happened was, he was beholden to Shuri. Shuri saved his life. He said, I am not going to turn these people. This woman saved my life. And then they repaid him by saving him from prison and brought him to his new home. Because for a little bit, he about to be Wakanda, right? So anyway.
So let's get to your last project. Well, the project that you've got with Marvel. It's coming out in February. Ghost Light. So can you describe the book's protagonists, character setting, themes, and what are you trying to say through this character?
Yeah, because I saw what you're saying about you're working for Disney. I'm
Yeah,
still
yeah. Well, so that's the other part of the question. But
right.
yeah, now you're working for financialized
Rooting
racial
for the mouse.
capitalism, being Marvel and Disney. And does this association contradict your previous stance, or do you see this as an incursion into a space that you can intrude a counter narrative?
That part. And like, so this is what's jumping off. So I don't know if you saw, but me and my friend Angelique, like I said, we're working on this book called My Superhero is Black, right? Which is a narrative around their Black characters, warts and all, actually, from 1950. So we talk about, whitewashing everything, right? I remember reading about this character when I was a kid. I probably saw a reprint of it. I know you're a Silver Surfer fan too, right? So
Yeah.
For some reason, Black folk connect with Silver Surfer. I love it, but I don't know. It's just something about the character. So issue number 5, 1969, there's a character called Alvin B. Harper. And in this issue, as you recall, like Silver Surfer could not escape the planet, right? Because Galactus puts
Put a barrier up.
a barrier up, right? So in this issue, the Silver Surfer is trying to escape that barrier. He bounces off of it. He falls to Earth. And a Black man, Alvin B. Harper, finds him, right? Because he's actually into rock hunting and stuff like that. Finds the surfer, befriends him, right? And asks him what's going on. And he's like, I'm trying to get off this planet, blah, blah, blah. Turns out that this man is a physicist, right? Physicist. And he says, you know what? I think I can help you. Now, we don't know why he's there. He's a research scientist. He even calls himself a mad scientist, but he's off in the woods in his cabin, right? Now, of course, Stan Lee, in his way, was trying to have a conversation about race, because I don't know if you remember or not, but that issue was called "And Who Shall Mourn for Him?" And who shall mourn for him? So he creates a Black character that sacrifices himself to save the planet. Because what happens is there's an altercation with the stranger. The Silver Surfer gets into it. Al Harper disengages this bomb the stranger puts on the planet. It releases a green gas that kills him. The Silver Surfer puts him into a grave and marks it with a cosmic flame that he says will burn forever, to mark him as a hero. And it changed the way that the Silver Surfer looked at humanity, actually, right? Stanley was asking us, this Black man just saved his life for you, saved the planet. He gave his life for you. Do you care? In some ways, he made a Black death matter story, heavy-handed, all the things that was, but he was trying to have a conversation about race, and people didn't like it. I actually have things from the letters page.
Okay.
So and they didn't like it. And he said, "Guess what? Go kick rocks." And that's what he said. He was like, I can send you this stuff. So Al B. Harper. So this is what happened. I'm working on this history book. I talked to Marvel. I said, and mind you, the context is like George Floyd protests, right? My sister just died. Chadwick Boseman just died. All these people are dying. Breonna Taylor's dead. I'm like, this man can't be in the ground.
Take your time, brother. Take your time.
I couldn't let him stay dead. And they greenlit it. They greenlit this man who was a scientist, and they let me make a superhero from him. It's a resurrection. I'm sorry.
No, brother.
So that's the context. That's the context. That's the context of it. And so he's a cosmic powered superhero that actually is a systemopath. He can actually talk to systems. So imagine someone to connect a star system to a computer system. That's his powers. So, because a lot of our problems are systemic. And I was like, what if I made a superhero that can actually talk to systems at a rapid pace? So he has these nanotech in his body that allows him to talk to systems.
How is he different than Sync?
Because Sync is actually like computer systems. He's just computers. I'm talking about all systems. I'm talking like more like So that's computer tech. Sync is the one. Sync is the one that
from the X-Men.
No, he's from the X-Men. He can actually mimic people's powers. He's more. Sync is more like a rogue, actually, in some ways, because he can actually sync with people's powers. That's why they call him that.
Yeah, but I thought Sync also worked through computers.
I mean, I thought it was Cypher, But you know, Cypher's like that. But yeah, but that so the thing is like he's on a cosmic level can actually talk to these different things because essentially like he has um it's the idea the whole universe is alive. You see what I'm saying? And so he can actually speak to these different. So he can actually have the entities inside of these different things like speak to each other, you know, but at a fast and light speed. So it's almost like he's not controlling things. He's actually discussing,
interacting
really fast, you know.
Okay.
So the other thing is that during the pandemic, a lot of the theaters were closed down, right? A lot of businesses closed down. Sorry for like getting all like emotional, but I was just like,
no, brother, that's real. Keep it real.
So the ghost light is a light that they put on to promise people that the theater will come back. And so all these ghost lights were in New York City and all the different things. And I was like, well, because they say that all the theaters are haunted, right? And so they had these ghost light celebrations and stuff. And I was like, you know what? That would be a cool name for this character. So I was like, yeah, ghost light. So, and who shall mourn for him, right? My story answers that question. It's call and response. So when Stanley asks us, and who shall mourn for him? I said, not only will we mourn for him, but these other people will mourn for him, right? And I don't want to give away too much, but I had to create an entire backstory for this black man who was created as a aside, you know what I'm saying? He was just created for that one and done kind of thing, you know? But you know how like in Marvel, they would draw these characters to actually have particular functions, like they'll draw them ugly, then they'll be evil, that kind of stuff. He was drawn beautifully. He was drawn like Luke Cage. You see what I'm saying? Like, he was drawn like Robbie Robertson. So he's a hero. And they wanted him to look, they wanted you to see him and see a beautiful black man and then see him die. And then actually like have that be a symbol of humanity to the Silver Surfer. You know, he's the first human being that befriended the Silver Surfer. And he was the first human to ride on his surfboard. Yeah, so he's an important character, but also forgotten in some ways. And so I can't believe that they let me do this character. And you know what's crazy is that 3 black men are working on this. Like, so I'm black. Valentine DeLandro is Canadian, from Trinidad, right? And then we got Tarn Clark as the lead cover illustrator. He's one of the top cover illustrators, a black man, you know. And so you got 3 brothers working on a Silver Surfer book.
So, you know, I actually have found that Marvel has been in the advance in that way. Remember when they married Storm and the Panther, they went and got Eric Dickey.
Eric, that's right. You know,
that was a 6-part miniseries.
It's pretty good. Yeah. No, they actually have been doing stuff like that. The other thing is that, you know, they have been leading the path with like these black and brown and queer, you know, what have you, like legacy characters. Because what's happened now is you have like Marvel is old enough to have like decent legacy characters, right? And so Miles Morales, you know, created by, you know, Brian Michael Bendis at the time threatened to leave Marvel. You know, they wanted to kill Miles Morales. Yeah, Brian Michael Bendis said he went to these conferences, these cons and stuff, you know, and he's white, you know. And,
I know.
And so he has 2 black daughters too. That's why he created Ironheart, by the way. Yeah, they adopted. That's why he created Ironheart is for them. So, so he said that he saw these convention, the black kids cosplaying as Miles Morales, and you know, loving that character, right? And he told Marvel, if you kill this character, I'll never write another word for you.
Good.
And that's how they fused him with the 616 universe, because they want to kill him. Yeah. Anyway, so sorry. But yeah, that's Marvel's been doing some really interesting stuff there. Ironheart, you know, is a cool character. I'm hoping that Ghostlight takes off and it becomes part of the piece. But yes, it's a countercultural thing. Yes, it's a massive company. Yes, they're gonna own them. You know, that's how, you know, I have my own intellectual property. I'm like, this is an opportunity to use that platform to talk about Black life and normalize Black ingenuity, because this dude was a scientist. You know what I'm saying? You know, this is cool. Anyway, sorry. All right.
Well, no, brother. Let's put it this way. This is an opportunity to see if you can survive behind enemy lines.
Yes. Yeah. Because
and we all operate in spaces like that.
Yeah.
But this is a big space you're going into.
It's a
And
big space. Yeah. And it's, it's at the beginning of it too, because, I do some consulting stuff. Working with them on different, as an editor, as a consultant on various things we can talk about later. And, they're open to these discussions because, it's the right thing to do, but mostly because it's profitable. I have to say, I mean, at the end of the day, they're a corporation. But
yeah,
my whole thing is that you have put out something like Black Panther, like Wakanda Forever, and there's no price on the type of empowerment that was meted out by those two things right there.
right.
Yeah. So I'm like, we like Bakor. Like, we working in PWIs, and
Yeah, absolutely.
you have to play, you stealing fire from the gods or whatever, and you're trying to
That's
you're
right.
doing it. You're trying to be
That's
Eshu,
right.
trying to be Eshu and steal divination and stuff. You know what I'm saying?
We
So
got
that's
to play the long game with them.
right, exactly. So
Absolutely.
that's
Because as you say, man, the inspiration that it can give to a kid, uh, many kids, is more value. It's worth the risk.
it's worth the risk.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And that's the nature of being colonized, that we work in those spaces as we seek to destroy them.
that's right. That's right. And so, there's people and there's allies in those spaces too, by the way.
That's right.
We want to get more of these voices in front of people. Yes, we're working in a capital space. Yes, we're working in a colonized space. But you do have folk who are like, you know what? There's a way for us to try to fix these wrongs and stuff. Because narrative, I think people are made out of stories. I think that we
Yeah.
are, we have to have control of our stories. And yes, I am doing my own independent work. You
Yeah.
see, we just got, we just had a massive Kickstarter for a Black horror anthology. $52,000 was raised by people who wants to see,
Mhm.
independent Black horror. So we're doing both.
Brother, I don't want to take up all your time, but this has been wonderful. We don't have questions, but we have praise coming through on the comments. People were digging the conversation. You took some folks back to the days of their father.
Mm.
So it's been wonderful, John.
Thank you, man. And
Brother,
again,
thank you.
yeah, I
And
appreciate it.
all right, let me sign off, my brother. Appreciate it.
Yeah, yeah.